Hi, friends. I'm Heather Miller, CEO and founder of social impact startup GrasshoppHer, talent acquisition and DEI specialist, mom of 2 humans and 3 fur babies, most under 4, former professional ballet and hip hop dancer, yoga teacher, interior designer, caregiver, provider, retirement planner, innovator, social connector, and the list goes on. As you can tell from my bio, I've always taken drive to the extreme, and for the most part, done pretty well juggling all of my hats. However, I say this on behalf of most of us, the past 3 years have been very challenging. My personal experience included moving to an unknown city, the unexpected death of my mother, and the birth of my first child 2 weeks later, launching a startup during maternity leave, the pandemic, building diversity strategies for a global corporation in the wake of George Floyd's death, another baby, and then, the icing on the cake, a layoff. I felt like I was approaching a midlife crisis with no space to do so. As a result, I've been thinking about balance and whether that's actually a thing. Join me as I speak with some amazing thought leaders and women in my life to understand how they keep the fire going and the lights on while staying sane. We'll explore drive, juggling priorities, taking no prisoners with your schedule, love and sickness, pursuing your dreams, enjoying the journey, and figuring out what is right for you. We hope these conversations help you err on the side of midlife epiphany versus midlife crisis. Welcome to Balancedness. Erin, welcome to Balancedness. It's so good to see you.
Thank you. Excellent to see you as well.
We've had you on speaking to our community before, but this is in sort of a new medium, and I'm excited to dig deeper into what you do and reach a broader audience. So introduce us. Introduce yourself to the community, and since we're talking about balancedness, like tell us all the different parts.
Sure. I'll do it in 30 seconds.
You don't need to. We got time.
Okay. So my name's Aaron Thweatt, Thweatt like Twitter, but spelled much differently. And I'm an executive coach. I had a long career in corporate America, and I learned a lot amongst the 5 different careers that I had, navigating all that transition during good economic times and bad. And so the last few years I've been coaching, and last year went full-time coaching here in Austin, but I hope globally, of course. And the core theme that drives me is managing the conversation. This is something I observed people when I was in my corporate and tech career, just how they move through organizations, the way they live their lives. It was such a skill they had about managing the conversation, establishing boundaries, all these different things, influence, negotiating. And it's the core thing that drives me. It's one of the main reasons I'm a coach, is to empower others to be able to harness this skill for themselves. Because managing the conversation is all the external conversations in your life and your career, but the most important conversation is the one you have with yourself. And so that's a lot of where my work focuses. So when it comes to balance, really managing the conversation is kind of the core skill set that underlies whether you actually achieve balance or not in your life. And that's something we can dive into today.
Yeah. And when you mean managing the conversation, a lot of things pop into my head. I've been having a lot of conversations lately with executives who are kind of trying to figure out next steps. And does that include like understanding the politics of the organization and using, I guess, conversation to navigate that? Like what specifically do you mean by managing the conversation?
It's all those things, right? It's being able to synthesize what all the possible inputs are in order to navigate that scenario. So it's understanding the both sides, what you want, and also how the audience will receive things, what their current perceptions are, and then devising an intention and then a strategy on how you want to move through that. So for executive leaders, and even parents who are CEOs of the household, but in that executive leadership position, understanding what you want and then how that is going to cascade to the organization is important. I know you've lived this life too, but in fast moving startup or, mid-sized companies, sometimes you think that the leaders just kind of do stuff and don't really consider the consequences. And then they have to one step forward and then 8 steps back to unwind what was done. And so sometimes you do have to make decisions quickly in business, of course, but where was the intentionality? Where was the forethought? And a little extra planning could really go a long way. And that's kind of a business approach to managing the conversation, but really it's just about personally, how do you have conversations from a non-limbic place and that non-reactionary? I think that's one of the core themes that I've illuminated with my own construct of managing the conversation. It's, we are humans, but with a very animal hardware in our minds, and that drives us, if unchecked, if unaware, to do things quickly. Now, if you're jumping out of the way of a car in the street, that's where it helps you. But if you're, with your family, if you're in the boardroom, it's not always as helpful. And so when we talk about negotiation or, communicating from a limbic place is not always the best.
Yeah.
Especially in high stakes situations, being able to be under pressure and maintain your cool is one of the best skills you can develop.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So yeah, well, let's dive into that. I think that could be fun, but let's start with balance and what balance means to you, since that's the theme of the podcast.
Sure. Balance, I was thinking about the theme is, we scheduled this and, there's the very common approach or common perception of balance. I think a work-life balance. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because is that a 50-50? Monday to Friday with most corporate jobs, it's not. Your semblance of balance was I worked 8 to 8 and then was able to still maybe see some family or go out and do things, at least work out, maybe get some good sleep. And those are kind of like the 3 categories that you hope to achieve outside of work most of the time. So but the perception of balance can become, I don't want to say skewed, but what is good balance is not necessarily 50-50 a lot of the time. But then I was thinking about it further, and I think if you reverse or back up even further to zoom out, going back to your own somatic body, what is your relationship with balance? Do you find yourself thinking that balance is working and doing a lot? And to answer your question concisely now, it's about trying to be more than do. And that's, for yourself, right? You are working in corporate, but then you're also a mother. And so navigating those two in a relationship in a proportion that you like, I think is the acceptable thing. What do I want in my life? Am I getting enough of that? And it doesn't always have to be consistent, at least for me, because I know that it's not always possible. I'm in a season right now where I'm building my executive coaching practice. And after working my face off in corporate America and tech for, a solid 18 years, I definitely have a much different relationship with time right now. I feel I'm more in control and I choose everything I do, as opposed to having to conform my schedule, my life to, the needs of the organizations I was in. And so I was happy doing it then, but not now. And so I'm choosing what I want now. And so really it's just about your choice. Are you being fulfilled in what you're choosing, as opposed to am I meeting an arbitrary metric of 50-50?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you tell us what you're choosing? Are you feeling more fulfilled and are you feeling empowered by being able to choose?
Yes, massively empowered. That was the key thing that I wanted to get to a stage in my life where I could do that. While I was working in corporate America, I worked for a lot of quote unquote cool companies, and that was great at the time. I think I needed it then. But then it also broke me of my desire for cool. And I started to realize that in my own personal world, my dream was greater than anyone else's. Agnostic of like the benefits of other companies and the things they're doing are definitely awesome. Their missions were no longer as important to me as what I wanted to do for myself, which was serve others on a timetable that I was in control of.
I love that. You and I met at a Grasshopper event.
Yes.
International Women's Day, and you asked some fantastic questions on the panel. And then since then, I've been able to get to know you a bit better and learn about your coaching practice and Respark. Can you tell us a little bit about Respark?
Yeah, thank you. Respark Coaching is the name of my coaching practice. And I chose that name because I believe we're all born with fire inside of us. And sometimes throughout life, that fire becomes diminished or extinguished. And so you have to respark it. And as I say to people that I work with, you're the torch and I'm the lighter.
I love it. I love it. I think when I first read your website, and I've told you this before, like it just, everything you wrote, your mission really, really resonated with me, and it still does. I read it again in anticipation of this chat, and it's so beautifully written. I'm sure people are really inspired when they happen upon you. So cool. So I know that salary negotiation, and we're going to talk about negotiation in general, is a priority for you at Respark. And why is salary negotiation such a priority for you?
Yeah, it is. It's a component. It's all part of this complete breakfast of what I do. And, I think I talk about salary negotiation a lot publicly because, as I'll go into, why I'm very passionate about it. And I feel it can be very impactful. But it's kind of a module or a component of the macro theme that drives me, which, as we discussed, is managing the conversation. It's just one of the most important conversations you can manage. And its magnitude and frequency is one of the most disparate. And so it's obviously so important. If you think negotiating your salary in a kind of a W-2 corporate sense, if you're an entrepreneur, you're probably negotiating daily, of what can drive your pay. But as an employee, is typically you only get one opportunity every 2 to 5 years, let's say, and it takes 1 minute to actually say the words in a negotiation during the job interview process to articulate what you want, if you really think about it. So you switch jobs 7 times in your career, that's 7 minutes to negotiate your entire life's earnings. And it's kind of a crazy concept. That's a minute you don't get to prepare for in school. They don't teach you how to do it. And it's, for a lot of people, it's kind of nerve-wracking. And so, as I mentioned, I've navigated a lot of change in my career, both different companies and completely different careers, different economic cycles, and having the benefit of one of those careers being 11 years spent in compensation for some of the best tech companies in the world, determining what to pay people. I was the one who said yes or no to managers and recruiters. So that was my 4th career. And, I had multiple careers before that. And I realized some of the mistakes that I made, or areas where I did negotiate, I could have pushed it harder. Because when you see the numbers and you see how everything works, everything just illuminated for me. And, when I left that corporate life and, wanted to become an executive coach and serve people, this is one of the key areas where I'm like, they have to know this. And I feel uniquely qualified because of my experience to be the one to educate and empower them on how to do it. And so I do focus on women specifically for salary negotiation, but overall, advocating for yourself is the theme.
That's such a crazy thing to think about, the 7 minutes or the 1 minute, because I'm sure for many of us, salary is one of the major drivers when we're thinking about new jobs, new careers, new industries, when we're going through transition. And to have 1 minute to advocate for yourself and change the course of things is pretty crazy, because I am sure that it's a focus and it takes up a lot of brain space for us. But you're right, in terms of the time that we have to articulate our thoughts and advocate for ourselves is very small. So What are the basic principles of negotiation, and how do these differ when you put them in the context of salary negotiation?
Yeah, there's a lot of pre-work, I think, that can enhance your success with negotiation. Being able to, as we were mentioning earlier, maintain yourself under pressure. When it comes to salary negotiation, it brings up a lot for people. What's your money mindset? What's your relationship with asking and putting yourself first? A lot of people, especially a lot of women, have told me, they don't like to brag. They feel like they're being boastful or braggadocious when they, probably should in this sense. And there's a scale. It's not a binary thing. It's a spectrum. Advocating for yourself and saying your skills and hard-won experience. I mean, if it's true, then it's just an admission of greatness rather than bragging. So the ability to articulate that's managing the conversation. And that's ultimately, I guess, maybe but an additional thing I'd like to say about managing the conversation is so many people either lean into it super hard and maybe come off as brash or overbearing or however you want to phrase it, or they retreat and say nothing. They're quiet. I hope to be recognized. And managing the conversation is really about being in that spectrum of the middle. You managing the tension and between those 2 points. You're staying in the game without, because even going too far and becoming brash and braggadocious, as some people may think, that's also a form of still not being fully present because you're just kind of bulldozing through. The art is about dancing with the conversation. And so when it comes to salary negotiation, all that pre-work that I'm talking about is, can you even handle those emotions within yourself? And that's probably a good chunk of like the first aspect of how I work with someone on when they call me up for, hey, I'm interviewing for a job or I want to start my job search and I'm expecting an offer soon. That we work on that because so many people have never actually negotiated or really pushed it. Maybe they've asked in the past, but your career grows linearly as you get more and more experience, but your leverage typically grows exponentially. And so if you don't ask the first couple times you switch jobs, and then you do start asking, you're the muscle of negotiating and asking, that's your somatic body. You may not be at a point where you're willing to ask and squeeze as hard as you could when you're getting to mid to later career, but I mean, definitely late, but even by mid, if somebody graduates college, takes their first job at 22, they don't negotiate that time. And then they switch jobs at 25 and they don't negotiate at that time. And then 29, okay, I take my first shot at negotiating. By the time, even then, but maybe early 30s or something like that, their leverage is pretty high in a lot of instances in many skill sets. And they're still thinking about when they were earlier in their career. Now they're in their mid part of their career and they could ask more typically, or just understanding the game and the nature. What elements can you pull levers on? Salary, equity, bonuses, sign-on bonuses. Those are important things to know when to pull, and DJing all those is in the right order to get the best outcome is an art, and that's something that I help with. Anyway, that's a lot of pre-work about your relationship with your money mindset and advocating for yourself. Then when it comes to the actual saying the words and negotiating, understanding that the negotiation starts on the first phone call when the recruiter asks, what are your salary expectations? And the way you answer that question can determine whether you paint yourself into a corner on the offer or not. So what I like to do with my clients is use that opportunity with the recruiter to say, I'm glad you're talking about this. What is your company's compensation philosophy for this role? Because the recruiter's asking, what are your salary expectations? It's like when you go onto a car lot, what's the first question they ask you? How much do you want to pay per month? It's like, what am I buying? So when the recruiter's like, what are your salary expectations? Like, what am I doing? How many of my skill sets do you need? What is the scope of the job? And if someone were to ask you, what are your salary expectations, you were to answer, there's a lot of assumptions that they've scoped the job appropriately. You fully understand it. It's at the right level. And they don't give any other type of incentives on top of salary. Especially in tech, when equity is a big component, it's always a conversation that happens later in the process usually, but being able to understand that full spectrum of what's on the table, both quantitatively and qualitatively, meaning the scope of the role, what you'll be doing, what your career growth prospects look like, they're all part of the whole equation. And so getting pigeonholed into having to answer this myopic question so early in the process where you know the least about the job and have minimal leverage, I'd rather have my clients punt, learn, gain some information by asking what the compensation philosophy is. Usually they're able to elicit what the salary range is and some other details from the recruiter so they can have a better understanding. Then usually the recruiter will bounce the ball back in their court. If they tell them the range and maybe the bonus structure or equity, they'll say, does that work for you? And then I like to say, well, I appreciate you sharing that with me. I'd like to understand the full scope of the role. And so the opportunity to continue interviewing would be really helpful so I can understand how many of my skill sets you need. What is the next step?
This is extremely enlightening. I've been through this process both as a recruiter and a recruitee many times. I've never heard anyone ask about a compensation philosophy. And I love that because it does give people the opportunity to understand more, educate themselves in the process of the conversation and empower them, gives them a little bit more leverage. So that's really interesting. One of the things that you mentioned is, only having a few opportunities to do this throughout your life. And it brings up a lot for us. You said in money and how you think about money, but I think that there's just an element of anxiety and vulnerability that comes into it. And why is it that negotiation makes some of us so nervous?
Gosh, it's typically, I've negotiated most of my offers, but especially early on, like I still felt fear. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think a lot of people feel some type of fear. Will me asking and deviating from what has been presented make them reject me? And I think it's a very human thing, and sort of on a tactical level in corporate America with jobs, I think there's a stigma, this perception that if I negotiate, they'll pull the offer. And I've never seen that.
Haven't either.
I feel like I don't know if it's from the 70s or something in a factory environment, but and so then the parents pass that down to our generation. I'm not sure. But as someone who made the decision, has done thousands of offers at some of the best companies, I've never made that decision. All my colleagues and peers and contemporaries, you've been a recruiter, so you're just on the spearhead as much as I am or have been in our careers. So we just don't see it happen. On the rare occasion it does happen, I've heard anecdotes. The answer is you don't want to work there.
Right.
Because imagine, it's a form of relationship employment. Imagine if you go to express your needs and it's automatic, like smackdown rejection or shutting down. Like imagine how you get into your career in that company. They're likely not going to be receptive, and it's not going to be conducive for you in the long run. So yeah, I would say you don't want to work there. But why we get scared is, maybe as we're children, right? Like some people are learned growing up that children are seen and not heard. That's a big one. There's another thing I think of, like, people, adults, parents are busy, taxed emotionally. And so a child has needs, expresses them, and finds that they don't land well. Parents aren't receptive maybe. And then we're very impressionable from 0 to even 12, right? So, but really 0 to 7 is like where all that software programming really gets set. And then we just learn from that. And then we move with that same emotional body in an adult world. And the stakes seem much bigger in that sense. Well, actually, they're just as big because it's like it's your survival as a child. But then you come into the corporate world and it's how much you earn, right? You're like, well, I'll take the job. They're going to give me something now, and rather than risk it all. And as you know, we've debunked here, negotiating is actually a big part of the skill set and the toolkit that everyone not only should have, but should be able to do or is expected to do in corporate America. You know, as corporate athletes, as Amazon describes some of their people. But there is no sports agent that represents for you. You have to play the game and negotiate the terms of your deal each time you switch teams. And that's actually a really great thing. It's really cool. But I think we're just not. So I think it's the fear of, you know, maybe the way you grew up, but then there's zero education on this, which is something I'm particularly shot out of a cannon about. You know, going to college, 4 years, 5 figures, sometimes 6, and then you fail the first question that you're asked upon graduation.
Yeah.
Not cool.
Yeah, it's something my husband and I talk about all the time, financial education in the school system. I mean, we're both really passionate about it. I think what I have heard is schools are getting better at teaching children the skills, but I definitely don't think we're there yet. And certainly with all the soft skill building in college and graduate school, I mean, this needs to be a priority, and it really isn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess the last thing I'll say on that is, you know, we kind of talked about and debunked that if you negotiate, they're going to pull the offer. It doesn't happen, and if it did, it's a blessing in disguise. You want to work there.
Right.
But for the result from my career and having seen the way things work, I say this phrase: every job offer negotiation is like a kitchen remodel. It deserves at least one good counter.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. You just told me that you are writing a book with Chris Voss, who is the guy on negotiation.
Yeah.
Can you tell the community a little bit about this book? How did this come about? How did you two meet? How did the involvement and how did the writing process go? Tell us everything.
I mean, completely separately, I met him several years ago at Summit Series in LA. So I had already known who he was, loved his book, and been following him. So I was traveling in Mexico City this year, and I woke up and saw an email where he says, "Hey, collaborate and write a book with me." So I got on the call, and you know, it was kind of with an agency that kind of develops these deals with celebrities and influencers and, you know, people who work in the knowledge space. And I listened to it and put in the application, told them my story, what my intention was, and what I wanted to talk about, and was accepted. And so Chris's next book is about using empathy in business. If you recall from Never Split the Difference, his seminal book on negotiation that kind of launched him into the known world, or you know, outside the FBI and all that, is tactical empathy was one of the core foundations. And so it was very interesting finding that book years ago, because that's when I was starting to manage the conversation as my philosophy, structure, and ethos on not only how I manage my life, but how I help others. And the tactical empathy part was like perfect, you know? So I was really excited when that opportunity came, because there's really no other author that I currently at this juncture align with the most as far as what we're trying to do, how we're trying to help others, and the way in which we're trying to do it. It's managing the conversation is my phrasing, but it's just so perfect because it mirrors and complements a lot of what he has done. And obviously he has so much experience as a negotiator in very high stakes situations. But I think being able to apply some of those things to your life and job offer negotiation is something that I hope to impart upon others. And the writing process was just telling my story, and leading into how I've managed the conversation at key junctures throughout my life that were very pivotal, that shaped my career and then ultimately led me to becoming an executive coach today.
And empathy in business, so important, but also this is like one of the key takeaways from his book as it relates to negotiation. But why is it important? Why is empathy important in both situations?
Yeah, a great question. It's, why is empathy important in life, right? As humans, we want to be seen and recognized, and to know that the other party isn't out for blood. They want you to win as well. And so it can be of mutual benefit. At least having that intention to explore options, I think, is what the underlying desire is, or appeal for empathy. And when I talk about when I talk about negotiating your salary and working with a recruiter throughout the job interview process, being empathetic to them, like they are your friend on the inside, and they have tons of recs, lots of candidates, and being able to make their job easier by interviewing well, and so they can send you through the process, is always good. And ultimately, when it comes down to negotiation, I guess the empathy part really comes to how to not make it personal. But you're talking about, it's you, the recruiter, and this ephemeral third entity, which is the problem. The salary is a little low, and it's not about me, and it's not about you. It's just, can you help me? Can we work and solve this together?
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit, and these are your words, and so I want to hear a little bit more. But when we were exploring this podcast, and I was looking for a way to connect balance and negotiation, you said an intersection of balance and negotiation is balancing the qualitative aspects of the job with the quantitative. So thinking about how hard you push on the numbers could potentially be calibrated in relation to what you think the job can give you intangibly. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yes. And the even more concise version of that is, every time you take a job, you have to consider learn versus earn. And so obviously early in your career, it typically skews more towards learning, right? Because you haven't worked in corporate America before, or a long time. It doesn't mean you can't earn. We don't want to put that notion out of our minds. But sometimes it's, if you do negotiate, and what I meant by quality, kind of calibrating how hard you push. If you deem the job to be like such a great stepping stone for you, development opportunity, great mentorship, experience and exposure, very marquee company, like, hey, if you work at McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, something like that, that's going to pretty much set you up for the rest of your career. And so understanding those qualitative aspects are important, because sometimes, and it has to do with leverage. There's been times throughout my career where I was like, I felt the somatic and emotional signal of like, I'll take any job or any offer they give, as it was 2009, bad economy, but you got to stay centered, and you have to keep an expanded view and not let your fear and sense of scarcity contract your vision in your world, so that you can make decisions from a place of as much abundance as possible. And then later in your career, when you're like, I'm now maybe the expert, or somebody who knows all the customers in this market segment, whatever the case may be, I have the leverage, and this company or the startup's trying to recruit me. Then you squeeze and say, yes, it is about the numbers to a certain degree. But other times in your career, maybe you want to make a transition, and you were earning well, but you just want to do something different. And so the other job doesn't pay quite as much as what you're used to earning, but that's, one step back for 10 steps forward. And that's at least a step back financially, but not in fulfillment. So understanding your relationship with all the qualitative, what you're going to learn, experience, how you're going to be able to contribute, and the way you're going to earn. Is it high salary? I have friends, I've been in clients that negotiate with startups and tech companies. There's an equity opportunity. Maybe the salary is a little low right now. Like when I worked at SpaceX, I took that job. The salary was like, okay. It was, I think, as a compensation professional, I could have received more in the market, but the equity opportunity, unicorns, private company, let's go. So
This is one of the questions I did want to ask you. Like, what are some of the trends in salary negotiation these days? Certainly with startups, it is getting into that equity. Are you seeing anything else that could be helpful for this community?
Sure. What I am seeing is, and this is actually something I've always seen, but I think with the way the economy is going, layoffs and people kind of moving out of companies and starting more companies, I think there's a lot more startup creation now, just because some people don't want corporate jobs or can't find a job. They're like, we could probably get a idea together and get product, an MVP and product market fit by the time I get a corporate job. Like job searches are taking up to 8 months right now.
It's brutal. I
Yeah.
just went through it, and everything you were saying about weighing the qualitative and the quantitative was something that I just dealt with. And it did. I gave myself 6 months, and I was squeaked in two weeks later than that. So 6.5 months. But yeah, that is pretty typical time period these days for the job search.
Right. And so what I'm seeing is companies not being super clear about the role and the type of candidate and what they're willing to pay. And so they just offer something, and it's like the Truman Show. Like if you don't push, or if you do push rather, like your hand will go through the wall. And so in opaque environments, opaque meaning there's not a lot of structure, levels, they don't have that job. There's you're maybe the first person in that job or at that level. Opaque environments will cut against you disproportionately if you say nothing, likely because they just haven't figured it out. They haven't really calibrated the scope of the role and what they're willing to pay. But if you do say something in an opaque environment, you can disproportionately win usually, because there's less guidelines and less rules and restrictions or internal peers to have to navigate around. So that's why managing the conversation in this job offer negotiation sense is so important. So I guess the trend of opaque environments seems to be growing. Also, even big companies, though, it happens too. People are unclear about what they want for the future. They just, a lot of layoffs. They're now trying to be very smart about when they add people back. And so that's always an invitation for you to have discussions to make sure you understand the scope of the role and what the impact and the value is to the company, and then that they see that you're the person who can deliver that, is probably the biggest trend, is being able to connect those two.
That's so interesting. I was just thinking about that earlier this week. How does someone think about or ask about their development potential, growth in the company in an opaque environment where maybe the recruiter, the managers, the leaders haven't even thought about those opportunities because they haven't gotten there yet?
Yeah, great question. And you've been a recruiter, and as the comp partner to recruiters in multiple tech companies, I've duked it out plenty of times on scope. There's been companies I've worked at where they say, well, we'll take a 2-year engineer or a 10-year engineer. I'm like, well, if a 2-year person can do it, why do you need a 10? And so having those discussions internally to narrow down the focus to make the candidate experience better and being the time to fill quicker, I can turn that lens and what's the mirror image of that to enhance your experience as a job seeker, to understand how the game works. How can you leverage that? Is definitely asking questions about vision, and that's where you start to test and see how much of a Truman Show it really is, because the recruiter has a lot of roles, and on the phone screen they'll be able to give some vision sometimes. I don't always, like when I was looking for jobs, I don't put the recruiter like their feet to the fire super hardcore on the phone screen. That's more for the hiring manager. Now if they can't give you, if the hiring manager can't give clarity, I don't want to say you have problems. I would say you have opportunities you haven't discovered yet. And that's where leadership and vision, probably the most important word is vision, can come into play. Because the hiring manager, whether they're a first line manager or a VP or SVP of a department or the CEO, they want someone with a vision, especially if they haven't figured it out. And so that's where you getting into your career, taking shots at stuff, meaning if you're an analyst, first 2 years in your career, and you're just like crunching Excel and just kind of putting the numbers together. And again, it's like, just do this and we'll figure out the strategy. You got to elbow your way in sometimes to figure out like how you can make recommendations so you can calibrate your ability to do that, because you will grow in your career faster when you're able to do that. If you wait too long for the natural promotion, you could be waiting until the 5-year mark when you could have gotten promoted at the 2-year mark. Point is, that ability to articulate the vision and the strategy, really whole separate topic, but it leads to executive presence. And that's one of the key, in my opinion, all else being equal, the key differentiator amongst people in companies about who gets promoted and who doesn't. So being able to communicate that vision concisely, with optimism, but not off the rails optimism, is really important, so that the leader can kind of latch onto that and be like, that's the person that we want for this role. That's if it's opaque, right? You have to figure out what they don't know that they want yet. Other times they have very specific, like, we want a developer with this specific language. And that's the thing, that's actually kind of the rub. Sometimes when companies are very, very clear and succinct up front about what they want, there's actually an opportunity to raise their ambition, which is it's a coaching thing, like I do with my clients. And so when you raise their ambition, it's showing that you're not just for now, you're a future value player. So you're good for the company now and in the future. You're going to not only help catalyze the growth of the company, but you're going to be able to carry it. Because we all know that there's sometimes people are in roles where they're good for now, but as the company grows or changes, they're not going to be able to hang. And so showing that you're able to be adaptive is very important in that regard. And especially if you're the one who communicates that vision to grow, then that's going to be a better opportunity for you to differentiate yourself as a candidate.
We're going to digress for just a second, but you just brought something up, which has been like a core theme in my conversations last week, which is executive presence. I've had so many people say like, oh, well, I'm looking to develop that. I'm looking to strengthen it. And it got me thinking, like, what exactly is executive presence in my mind? And I'm curious to see what it is in yours.
Yeah, it's several pillars. It's obviously competence in the job. That's like almost, I'd describe that as the pre-work. That's the foundation of the building that's under the ground. Very necessary, but you don't see it per se. So the people that exude executive presence are the ones that are able to communicate vision concisely and also be able to handle challenges without catastrophizing. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think, as starting out as a compensation analyst, looking through proxies and crunching Excel and just looking at numbers and kind of being like over there in that cubicle all the time. Versus like being able to present, start doing board materials, present to, our SVP of total rewards, that type of stuff, is being able to articulate things concisely, but then flag risks, and not have it be the sky is falling. I have seen other people in my career phenomenal on knowledge, like deep and wide, like they could do anything. But in a fast-paced startup environment, when management makes decisions that we wouldn't agree with, like, why would you do that? Like, we're halfway through the merit cycle and you want to change the equity vesting schedule. What? Rather than, overly complaining about it, or saying like in a almost a hurt sort of way, like all the things that are going to come from that, being able to talk about it from a, operationally, here's the risks. And, if you want to decide to do that, great, here's our plan to execute. If you want to do that, just want you to know the full scope of what's potentially going to happen if we do this. It's maybe the same literal message, but delivered way differently. So being concise, competence in the role, being concise in what you deliver, not catastrophizing when talking about challenges and opportunities, I think are the three main ones. there's probably a few more, and I'm working on fleshing it out, and something actually in 2024 I'll be probably coming out with either an ebook or maybe an interview series on. I already have a list of people. I have an illustrious coworkers from my corporate career that when I think of executive presence, I have a long roster of who has that, and I want to get their thoughts because
That's so cool. I was literally just thinking like, maybe I'll spend the afternoon in Barnes and Nobles looking for some good reads, but I'll just wait till you come out with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about negotiation, restoring balance in the professional world, but what about on a personal level?
Yeah, that's big.
Yeah.
It's, again, it goes back to starting with your somatic body and understanding, what is your relationship to being rather than having to do. Some people grew up in chaotic environments, and so that makes them want to bounce around in life a lot. And just sitting is a challenge. And, something for myself is I was very go, go, go. My entire corporate career was, I felt I would hit some type of pinnacle. I'm from Alaska, and the state's motto is the last frontier. And then I went to SpaceX. So I went from the last frontier to the final frontier. And I think that's pretty cool. But the drive, the reason why I got there was a lot of externally based reasons. Wanting validation, wanting security and success in a construct that was kind of out of my control. I wanted to join something else that I felt was going to be successful because I didn't feel I had the agency at the time to do it myself. And that was the big shift for me. A lot of work that I did on myself to be able to say W-2 life is now no longer the opportunity for me. If anything, it's a limiter. And I feel ready and confident about building something on my own in order to achieve my success and impart my message and be of service on my terms. So how that cascades to my personal life, though, is like that's shifting a lot of things. Fortunately, I've always had very good people in my life, and that's been something that's very easy for me to curate. But personally, I think you have to understand, is there relationship aspects that I have allowed that are not serving me? Because your relationships can throw your life out of balance. Other than you saying yes to that relationship, it's, it may feel like out of your control. And so that's how you take your agency back, is like, what is my role in this? And how did I allow this to come or allow this to persist? It's probably one of the biggest things you could do just with those two questions when considering balance in your personal life, both with your relationships, but maybe your financial situation. Maybe don't look at your numbers. If you're concerned about your health, looking at your habits and routines, it's all the same stuff a lot that a coach could say. But again, much like executive presence, the part of the building that is the foundation under the ground that is unseen are those consistent habits and routines around diet, interpersonal relationships, your finances, and how you think about and articulate your own intention for the future, and not allowing yourself to drift. I think is another one of the biggest things that isn't talked about a lot. And that's how I think people get a sense of like, oh, I'm out of balance. It's because they've drifted away from their goals, or they haven't worked on that art project for 3 years and they used to love painting, whatever the case may be. That continental drift seems slow, and then suddenly you're like on a different continent. What happened?
That's actually something we talked about in last week's podcast, just self-pacing and self-checking against priorities. Our last podcast guest said she checks in on her priorities, her personal priorities, every quarter, which I thought was a phenomenal practice and super diligent, as self-discipline. Do you do that?
Yeah, I have calendar, time blocks, invites, reminders, so that I have my own check-ins, because I spend a lot of time looking at my calendar. And I don't want to have to hold it all up here. I write some stuff down, but I'm very digital. So it's all on my calendar, and being able to have condensed lists of like what I'm working on, what's important to me, even as a coach, I'm finding better ways that, I should improve and how I organize and prioritize. But doing it is so important, because I used to be in a world of, especially my corporate career, I was just like, it was just kind of a blur. Just show up to work. I could do work well, but I stopped doing my personal life well. I started letting things slip because I allowed work to continue to encroach. And that corporate beast will consume everything you're willing to give it, and then more. So like being able to manage up, it's actually another executive president saying managing up. We can talk about that if you want, but being able to do those things so that you can prioritize. And really it's about creating a container. Because if you have no shape, if your schedule, your life, your day is this amorphous thing, you'll just get kind of railroaded on by other people's priorities. And so being able to have boundaries, both literally and figuratively, is probably one of the biggest keys.
Yeah, actually, that was another episode we did a couple of weeks ago on boundaries with respect to relationships, to the work-life balance, the concept of work-life balance. Yeah, so important. Well, I want to do some rapid fires since we're getting to the end of the episode here. And so we play a little game called yin or yang. So it's kind of like a would you rather with respect to balance. And I know you love music, hanging out with friends, arts, travel. So here's a couple of questions related to that. So yin or yang, going to a concert or listening to a new album front to back at home?
Probably listening to a new album front to back at home.
Me too. I love doing that. I used to have friends over and we would, this is so nerdy and artsy, but like collage, like tear up magazines and collage.
Yeah.
According to sort of the theme of the album, but I love doing it. Nice. Okay, going out with friends or having them in?
Going out.
Okay, why?
Having the opportunity for spontaneousness about, what's in the environment. Maybe we're at a concert, maybe we're at an art gallery, and just being able to have a shared experience, maybe something adventurous, out in the woods, but being able to have a shared experience as a group is always fun. I mean, hanging out and talking is fun too, but I chose going out because you can do that too.
Yeah. My last podcast guest introduced me to the label novelty seeking, which I understood that concept, but it's so present in my life. So I was happy there was a name for it, a label, and I sort of dug into it this week. But I think there's an element in the spontaneity, seeking new things and new experiences, which I'm always down for. Okay. Yep. And finally, whirlwind travel or like digging in, like spending a month in one spot?
Digging in. I've done the whirlwind, and I'm like, I did Rome for a day and a half. I'm like, I didn't make it to the Vatican. Like, how did I miss that? So
I know, so much FOMO when you do that. Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. My eyes are opened every time I chat with you, and I know our community is going to really benefit from this. So appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Heather. I'm happy to have further discussions, here to serve. My company, Respark Coaching, is kind of dedicated to helping people advocate for themselves in all realms of their life. So that's what I'm here to do.
Love it. We'll include all the links, websites, resources in the show notes. So glad we know where to find you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for supporting another episode of Grasshopper's Balancedness podcast. If you liked it, please rate, review, and subscribe on our Apple and Spotify pages. Send me a screenshot at hello@grasshopher.com. That's GRASSHOPPHER to enter yourself into this episode's surprise raffle. And be the first to hear about upcoming episodes and events by signing up for Grasshopper's newsletter, which can be found on our website. Happy balancing until the next time.